Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Islam's Golden Age, Fall of the Abbasids by Epic History TV. So last time we saw the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate and all of the art, science, culture, and prosperity that came along with that. Now, we ended last time's video with the death of the great Caliph Harun al-Rashid in the year 809. In this video, we get to see the aftermath of his death. I'm excited to get into it. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
In the 8th century Middle East, a new dynasty seized control of one of the world's greatest empires.
Yes.
The Islamic Caliphate.
And look at that. What we saw last time was the transition from the absolutely massive Umayyad Caliphate to the Abbasid Caliphate. And the Abbasid Caliphate ushered in this new golden age of, like I mentioned in the intro, art, science, culture, and prosperity, a lot of which was centered around the city of Baghdad.
Little remembered in the West today, the Abbasids reigned for 5 centuries. They oversaw an era of Islamic military dominance, city building, brilliant scholarship, and technological innovation. It has come to be remembered as Islam's Golden Age.
Yeah.
This is the story of the Abbasid Caliphate.
Part 2, the fall. Well, we've gone from the rise to the fall. How appropriate.
It's great to welcome back as video sponsors Raid Shadow
There
Legends.
we go. Alright, so I say this every time, but especially since this is a new video, guys, please go and check out the original video. I'll have it linked down below. Go and watch the original video in its entirety. Go and check out Epic History TV's sponsor, leave them a like, subscribe to the channel, show them support for making these fantastic videos. You know, with these reactions, we want to be supporting the original creators, and I want to absolutely make sure we do that. Alright, we have that straight? Fantastic. Let's get back to the reaction. And al-Rashid has sown among them constant warfare, so woe to the subjects in the future. Interesting. So I feel like what that might suggest, and I don't know if this is true, I imagine we'll see, what that suggests is that though Harun al-Rashid was this very impressive caliph with this very impressive reign, perhaps he didn't set the empire up for the best future. You know, maybe he had this very impressive reign, but once he was gone, things started to decline. At least, that's how I read that quotation. Maybe I'm reading too far into it.
The Abbasid Caliphate had flourished under the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid.
Yes.
And to ensure its continued success, he arranged his succession in a way that he believed would ensure stability and peace.
Okay.
His son, Muhammad, was to be his heir, but in a move common since the time of the Umayyads, he also named another son, Abdullah, as Muhammad's heir. It proved a recipe for disaster.
Damn. Yeah, so this is an issue very common to dynasties like this. We can look at, say, the Roman Empire as an example. These types of empires or dynasties, you often have a great emperor, and then you have a terrible succession. There are many, many examples in Roman history. You know, Marcus Aurelius would be one, but you could point out a lot of them. And succession tends to fall to the wayside, even when you have a great emperor. Maybe they don't pay attention to succession, or it seems that this is more a case where he has paid attention to succession, but maybe in the end it just doesn't work out. You know, it's hard to ensure things go a particular way after you are dead. That's why succession can be such a tricky thing.
In 809, in Baghdad, Muhammad succeeded his father as caliph,
All right.
taking the title Al-Amin, the Trustworthy. His half-brother, Abdullah, became governor of Khorasan with the title Al-Ma'mun, the Trusted One. Rival factions soon formed at
The Trusted One. Well, let's see if he lives up to that name.
both courts. In Baghdad, Al-Amin's advisors urged him to remove his brother from the succession. And just a year into his reign, he tore up his father's arrangement.
And that's what I said. It's really hard to make sure things go a particular way once you're dead. You know, Harun al-Rashid, he sets up this line of succession, which is not an uncommon thing. They said that it was common practice in the caliphate. It's common practice even beyond the caliphate to choose your successor, but then basically choose their successor for them. But once you're dead, what is to stop the current guy, in this case Al-Amin, from saying, you know what, we're not going to do that? Well, the only thing that could stop that is some sort of backlash or rebellion. I guess we'll see where this leads.
Al-Ma'mun was furious. Fraternal distrust exploded into civil war.
There you go.
Al-Ma'mun's Khorasani forces won a great victory against a much larger force at Ray and marched on to besiege Baghdad in 812.
Uh-oh.
After a bloody year-long siege, the city fell. Caliph Al-Amin was captured as he tried to flee and executed.
Well, I guess that's how you prevent someone from messing with succession. Like I said, it leads to a rebellion, and then they're done away with.
Initially, Al-Ma'mun ruled the caliphate from his old base at Merv.
Oh, interesting.
Here, in an effort to widen his support after the civil war, he fostered a new alliance with the Alids. This powerful family was descended from Ali, fourth caliph and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad.
You know, and once again we see this, and family ties being important is of course not unique to the caliphate, absolutely not, but given that the caliphate is so tied up with religion, anyone who has any sort of relation to Muhammad, however that be, or in this case Ali, of course there's linkages there, that gives them a big reputational boost that can really make your career, and you can sort of understand why with the religious importance of these individuals, right?
They'd later become leaders of Shia Islam, the branch of Islam that believes true spiritual authority belongs to Ali's descendants. Instead of traditional Abbasid black, Al-Ma'mun's court began to wear green, a color associated with the Alids.
Interesting. And, you know, if I think today, what is the color most associated with Islam, I'm going to think green, easily. I mean, that is a color that has become sort of on the geopolitical stage, culturally, is quite associated with the religion of Islam.
Al-Ma'mun even married two of his daughters into the Alid family, and made Alid Imam Ali al-Rida his heir apparent. But these policies sparked hostility back in Iraq.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so he's doing something interesting where he's trying to build out this new base of support in the East. And to be fair, we've seen a lot of revolts, a lot of unrest in the East. And that is, you know, where Al-Ma'mun had sort of originally built up his support. So it makes sense that he would continue on that path. But that's probably going to cause some unrest in the West. We have some really interesting dynamics going on in the Caliphate at this time. Dynamics that have already been occurring for a while between different people groups, different ethnic groups, East and West. You know, some fascinating stuff. Pretty hard to juggle if you're Caliph.
And led to major revolts in Baghdad.
Right.
After 6 years, the Caliph moved the capital back there to restore order, and abandoned his Alid alliance.
Damn.
Al-Ma'mun is also remembered for his attempts to impose a new religious doctrine on the Caliphate.
Oh?
He first invited distinguished scholars to Baghdad to discuss theological issues, such as the deeds of the companions of the Prophet, the hadiths, and the nature of the Quran.
Okay.
However, his pronouncement that the Quran was at some point created by God, rather than co-eternal with God, encountered bitter resistance.
Yeah, that seems like a very controversial claim to make. And, you know, you have this interesting interplay. Obviously, the Caliph and these religious scholars have a lot of control over the interpretation of these documents, but people have their own opinions, their own very strongly held spiritual views, and so there's sort of only so much you can do before people start saying, no way, we don't have to accept that. You know, we have our own beliefs that we've been taught and we know to be true in one way or another. You know, these firmly held religious beliefs. And that's the thing, when you start messing around with religion, it can get very spicy very quickly. People are very passionate about that sort of thing.
18 years of religious persecution followed, a period known as the Minha, or Inquisition, which saw dissenting scholars imprisoned.
I mean, Inquisition, when we think about that from say, a Western or a Christian perspective, very negative connotations, very negative.
Or even executed. In 833, Al-Mamun was succeeded by his brother, who took the title Al-Mutasim. He'd prove far less interested in theological debate than the clash of arms.
Okay. Different caliphs are interested in different things. What do we have here? When troops are all of one race, dangers arise. They lack zeal and they are apt to be disorderly. It is necessary that they should be of different races. Interesting. That is a very interesting perspective. And I imagine here by race, we're talking about different people groups, different ethnicities. And yeah, that's sort of an interesting perspective, I guess. I'm curious to see how that relates to what we're about to be shown. I mean, I don't think I agree, but I guess it depends on whatever context we're going to see.
The armies of the Abbasid Caliphate, renowned in battle, were drawn from both Arab and non-Arab subjects.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, this has been sort of a big point in the history of the Caliphate. Of course, initially, we are talking about basically exclusively Muslim Arabs. But very quickly, very, very quickly, as the Caliphate expands, we bring in a whole bunch of different people groups. And in fact, there are significant numbers of non-Muslims within the Caliphate. But even within the Muslim population, there are a lot of different ethnicities. Of course, Persian is very prominent. You know, there was the whole Sassanid Persian Empire that existed still not that long ago, and a lot of its people and culture and traditions still remain, which I think is why we see a lot of unrest in the eastern provinces of the Caliphate, because they sort of have their own thing going on to a certain extent. And so, yeah, we've seen some interesting sort of ethnic and racial dynamics so far, where non-Arab Muslims have felt like they're getting the short end of the stick. They're being treated as second-class citizens when they shouldn't be, because they're Muslim. They should be treated equally to any other Muslim, regardless of ethnicity.
The Khorasanis, soldiers of the frontier province of Khorasan, were the troops who'd helped propel the Abbasids to power during the Third Fitna, or Islamic Civil War.
Right.
Drawing on Persian and steppe warrior traditions. Their ranks included both armoured infantry and heavy armoured cavalry, similar to European knights.
Right. And you can definitely see sort of the joint influences, because there are a lot of horse riding cultures out east, a lot of nomadic cultures in the steppe. Of course, they're very focused on cavalry, on horse riding, but the heavily armored cavalry, that to me is a little more reminiscent of the Persian influence. So you can sort of see how those things can join together and result in this particular culture, this particular way of warfare.
The descendants of Khorasanis who settled near Baghdad were known as Abna al-Khorasan, sons of the people of Khorasan. Famed as elite and versatile infantrymen, they formed the loyal core of the Caliph's army.
Right, okay.
Other notable contingents included the Dailamis, expert skirmishers from the highlands of northern Persia. While African troops, including military slaves and Muslim converts from Ethiopia, fought as heavy infantry, armed with shield, sword, and spear.
Interesting. And we've done a reaction to, I believe it was one of Epic History TV's videos on slavery within the Caliphate. Some really interesting stuff. You can check that out. I'll put it in the top right corner. But a sort of interesting dynamic they had, but they certainly had an institution of slavery.
The great Caliph Harun al-Rashid was known to have an elite bodyguard of 40 African soldiers.
Wow.
Abbasid armies were particularly skilled in siege warfare and made expert use of catapults, mangonels, and battering rams. They even had special...
That's fascinating because, and I am no expert on the history of the Caliphate. What little I do know, I know more about the earlier Caliphate, as in we're talking Rashidun and Umayyad. And when I think about that early period, I think about the armies of the Caliphate. You know, they were very strong in terms of cavalry. That was like their main thing. And not so strong when it came to siege warfare. But, you know, I'm sure you can imagine, you know, it's been, you know, we're talking a long time at this point. You know, we're going on 200 years. And so you can imagine how they could develop those sort of skills, those sort of military tendencies over time, especially if they're dealing with a lot of siege warfare. You might pick things up, say, from the Persians or the Romans or whomever, and adapt these ideas and skills into your own military culture.
Specialist troops armed with naphtha or petroleum-based fire weapons.
Whoa.
No contemporary illustrations are known, but they're thought to have been similar to this slightly later Byzantine illustration.
I was going to say, the use of fire in that way sounds very Byzantine to me. We remember, you know, the Greek fire of the Byzantines.
The 9th century, however, would see changes so radical that some historians have termed it a military revolution.
Oh, okay. Goodness.
During the civil war between al-Rashid's sons, al-Mu'tasim had begun to expand his military retinue by purchasing Turkish slave soldiers. His favorite supplier was the Samanid family, governors of Transoxiana.
I like the modern overlays they give, and now we see the Turks coming into it. I'm sure there's been Turk involvement before this, but, you know, we're talking about the mid-9th century at this point. If we want to take a look at the next couple centuries of history in this region, or just Islamic history overall, man, there's going to be a big Turkish influence. You know, keep an eye on the Turks, because they're going to become super, super important to the history of this region.
These slave soldiers were seized from their villages as boys, or bought in slave markets, then sent for intensive military training alongside an Islamic education.
Right.
They emerged as formidable cavalrymen and superbly skilled mounted archers.
You know, once again, you think of that Eastern steppe culture with the cavalry, especially, you know, mounted archers. That was a big part of sort of steppe military culture, so you can see the influence there.
Al-Jahith, a contemporary, wrote of them with awe. The Turks are as good as others with the lance, and in addition, if 1,000 of their horsemen are hard-pressed, they will loose all their arrows in a single volley and bring down 1,000 enemy horsemen.
Wow.
No body of men can stand up to such a test.
Yeah. And maybe, you know, 1,000 of them under pressure, they loose arrows, kill 1,000 horsemen. That's a little over-exaggerated, but it is true that because we're talking about, say, an Eastern versus Western perspective, we're talking about these Eastern Turkish horse archers, and then they're brought westwards by the Caliphate. Whenever you have these Western armies, you might think about, I don't know, the Byzantines. When they came into contact with horse archers, they had a really hard time dealing with them. It is true that these horse archers were extremely formidable in combat.
Historians dispute the exact timeline, but at some point in the 9th century, these Turkish slave soldiers, known as Mamluks, had come to form an elite corps within the Abbasid army.
Okay, so now we see the emergence of the Mamelukes, who will be very important in Islamic history for a long time to come. And we also see this interesting thing happen, where we have this corps of slave soldiers who, over time, sort of become an elite corps of soldiers. And you might think that's a little bit odd because of their, status as enslaved people, but, it is something that we have seen and will see in other places. I think of, for example, the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire. I know that's a long way in the future, but these were, once again, boys enslaved and trained as soldiers, educated, and over time, these elite Janissary corps of slave soldiers would become these elite corps, and they had a lot of political influence. So it's sort of interesting to see that evolution, but it's not something that you don't see elsewhere, right? This is something that we can point out in several different places. I guess it's oftentimes we think about slavery in a particular way. We might think about American chattel slavery. That's sort of the first thing my mind goes to. But slavery, of course, has been used throughout human history in a sort of variety of different ways, all of which are terrible, all of which truly are a crime against one's autonomy. But slavery has been used in a variety of different ways, and you can sort of understand if you used enslaved people to play a particular role, how that role can evolve over time, especially if it's an important role like these horse archers, right? So it's interesting stuff, in my opinion.
One that was personally loyal to the Caliph and could be used to intimidate his political rivals. Turkish officers, despite their initial outsider status and ignorance of Arabic language and customs, began to wield huge influence at the Caliph's court.
Interesting.
This offense.
That's interesting, because when I think about Turkish influence in this era, I often think about the sort of mass Turkish migration from east to west. But here, we're seeing something a little more subtle, which is these Turks brought in, through enslavement it appears, but who grew to have quite the influence sort of within the boundaries and institutions of the Caliphate. Not necessarily taking it over by storm, at least not yet, but a little bit more from the inside.
Did the old nobility, many of whom also stopped receiving traditional diwan payments for their military service. The discontent even pushed some soldiers to riot in the streets of Baghdad.
Wow.
To ease tension, Al-Mutasim constructed a new city for the Turkish military elite, Samarra. This was where he garrisoned the Turks and rewarded their commanders with land. And it's where, in 848, work began on the world's largest mosque.
Wow.
And its famous spiral minaret. Al-Mutasim's reliance on slave soldiers to shore up his power had destroyed centuries of military tradition.
Yeah.
And it had sown the seeds of future turmoil. 2 years later, the Caliph led his formidable new army against the old foe.
All right, back west. We have seen so much conflict against the Roman Empire, and at this point, they are an old foe. I mean, it's been hundreds of years, and, they can never stop going at each other. Each of these empires has a lot of other issues to deal with, but they keep coming back and forth, fighting over the border. Once again, we have more engagement with the Romans. The Romans, who are not nearly as formidable as they once were. We have a juxtaposition here, the Caliphate, as strong as it's ever been, and the Eastern Roman Empire, as you might be able to see if we, focus on them more on the map, probably weaker than they've ever been.
The Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. The campaign ended in a great victory, the capture and sack of Amorium. Oh, day.
Amorium, pretty prominent city in Anatolia, which of course was a very important province within the remaining territory of the empire.
Of the Battle of Amorium, our hopes have returned from you, overflowing with honey-sweet milk, wrote Arab poet Abu Tamam.
Right.
But even such victories failed to ease the tension between Turkish officers and Abbasid nobles.
Well, yeah. I mean, of course that wouldn't ease the tension. If you're seeing more and more victory, I imagine these Turks are doing even better within the structure of the military. That's certainly not going to ease the tension that's happening within your own military, right?
Some nobles even plotted to overthrow al-Mutasim and expel the Turks.
It's becoming a real problem now. But this is what happens when you try to change some sort of institutional, traditional structure, right? The military structure and traditions of the Caliphate have now been developing for a while. And basically, in a rather short period of time, you have upended those traditions, upended those structures. Now, these things happen when you're running an empire or running a state of any kind, but you're going to have a lot of disgruntled individuals who took part in that system and now feel like they've lost their status.
But their conspiracy was discovered, and they were executed.
The Turks have become master of the realm. The world must fall silent and obey. Oh, you get an idea of how they were feeling, of course, from that quote.
Al-Mutasim was succeeded by his eldest son, Al-Vathik. Following his unexpected death, a second son, Al-Mutawakkil, took the throne, backed by the Turk generals. They'd hoped for a pliable...
And exactly like I described earlier, as they grow in influence, become a military class of their own, now they're gaining serious political influence. That is sort of how it works, especially in such a militarized society, one in which military action is so important that sort of directly leads to political power.
Puppet. But instead, Al-Mutawakkil decided it was time to reassert caliphal authority.
Oh, okay.
On his orders, several Turkish leaders were assassinated, and he tried to use Arab and Armenian troops to counterbalance their influence.
Interesting.
But the Turks struck back.
And now it's gotten out of his control. So we saw these Turkish slave soldiers were initially sort of a tool of the Caliph in order to bolster his armies and bolster his own position. But, and by the way, this is exactly what happened with the Janissaries within the Ottoman Empire as they gain more and more influence. Well, eventually the Caliph, whoever the Caliph may be at that time, no longer has control over them. And this is true more broadly, not just, the comparisons to the Janissaries. That comparison is similar in a lot of ways, but if you just zoom out, look more broadly, sometimes within running a state or running an empire, like I said, you upend old systems, you create new systems. And to do that, you might create a new class of individuals to run those systems. This might be military, it might be political, it might be civil. What can happen is that if they are successful, over time, this new class of whatever they may be, soldiers, officers, administrators, depends on the situation, will become more and more influential. And eventually, your emperor or your caliph or whoever might want to strike back, but well, they're beginning to lose their influence to this new influential class, and it's already gone too far. So, interesting stuff.
861. The Caliph was assassinated by his own bodyguards.
Also, this is typical Roman stuff. Typical empire stuff more broadly. You think of like the Praetorian Guard in Roman history. You know, your own personal guard gets more and more powerful over time. Yeah, eventually they're going to start assassinating the emperor.
The chaos and civil war that followed is known as the Decade of Anarchy.
Oh, that's not good.
4 caliphs took power, all puppets of the Turkish military elite.
Wow.
Each, in turn, was violently overthrown.
This is very Roman-esque. They're really taking a page out of the Roman history books and saying, all right, well, why don't we have many caliphs in a row that are basically controlled by their own guard, and they constantly get murdered and or die mysteriously under suspicious circumstances.
Order was only restored with the accession of Caliph al-Mu'tamid in 870. But the anarchy had irreparably damaged the Caliph's authority.
Damn.
Even before the Abbasids came to power, the vast caliphate had struggled to maintain control of its many regions.
I mean, yeah, look at it. And by the way, at one point, the caliphate extended further, and this we're talking about the end of the Umayyad Caliphate, but extended all the way through North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula. But even just look at this, it is a massive expanse of territory. To be able to operate all of that, that takes a lot of resources and is a very difficult thing to do.
Abbasid authority west of Egypt had long been largely theoretical.
Right.
But now, multiple major uprisings broke out as local governors and warlords staked out their own claims to rule. Egypt, fertile and prosperous.
And you see, we already saw the Emirate of Cordoba out there in the west, that is the Iberian Peninsula. We see these sort of important areas with their own rich history, especially if they are prosperous or powerful, especially if they're far from the core. The Iberian Peninsula, that's really far from the core of the empire, so it's easier to break away. Egypt, it's a little closer, but Egypt has its own history, its own culture, has always been rather prosperous. It's these provinces that are the first to go.
Was an early casualty, lost to a rebel Turkish commander who founded his own Tulunid dynasty.
And of course, not even to talk about Egypt's history before this, but if we look forward throughout, this point towards the present day, Egypt has a very complicated history. At times, many times it'll be under the domination of foreign powers, but Egypt will really maintain its own identity, its own culture, oftentimes its own autonomy, its own way of doing things.
In southern Iraq, a major revolt broke out among agricultural slaves from Eastern Africa, known as Zanj.
Right.
The 14-year uprising devastated the region and severely disrupted Abbasid tax income.
Oh, I'm sure. That's a rebellion that is right in the center of the empire. That is going to be seriously disruptive.
And Baghdad's food supply.
Right.
In Afghanistan, a coppersmith named Yaqub al-Safar made an astonishing rise to power, founding his own Safarid dynasty and conquering much of eastern Persia.
That's incredible. Oh,
his advance was only halted at the Battle of Deir al-Akul in 876. In such turbulent times...
Wow, okay, this is going worse than I thought. The Abbasid Caliphate, not only is it going through anarchy and chaos, but the empire is basically falling apart. They're losing their eastern provinces, they're losing Egypt, their authority throughout North Africa has basically faded away. Everything is truly crumbling.
Abbasid caliphs struggled to impose their authority.
Losing territory in the north.
There were some successes. Caliph al-Mu'tadid engineered a brief Abbasid resurgence, thanks to military campaigning and shrewd diplomacy.
Oh, okay.
Notably his marriage to the daughter of the Tulunid ruler of Egypt.
Ah, smart.
She was the celebrated Kutral Nada. Her name means dewdrop. One scholar described her as one of the most intelligent and regal women who ever lived.
Oh, well, that's nice. And I can imagine at this point, Egypt is not that far separated from the rest of the caliphate. It hasn't been that long. And so it is a little easier to bring it back in through diplomacy or, a smart marriage like this.
When Al-Mu'tadid told his bride, "You've done well for yourself by marrying the caliph. What more could you thank God for?"
All right, come on.
She replied, "You've done well for yourself. This makes my father your subject. What more could you thank God for?"
Yeah, I like that. She gave it right back to him. He was like, yeah, I'm a pretty good catch. And she was like, hey, think again. What about me?
Her bold response was a sign of her character, as well as the delicate new balance of power between Abbasid caliphs and some of their more powerful subjects.
This is true. Yeah, that sounds like one of those quotes that was probably made up, let's be honest. A lot of the nice quotes you hear throughout history are made up or misattributed, but one of those quotes that is sort of used to depict this new relationship. And by the relationship, I don't mean the relationship between these two. I mean the relationship between the Abbasid Caliph and Egypt at this point, the new dynamic within the Islamic world.
During the reign of Al-Mu'tadid's son, Al-Muqtafi, Tulunid Egypt was fully reabsorbed into the Abbasid Caliphate.
All right, nice.
But elsewhere, the news was dire.
Uh-oh.
Abbasid authority collapsed in Arabia, where one Shiite group, the Qarmatians, even began attacking pilgrims on their way to Holy Mecca.
Uh-oh. And that's a really important region to start losing control over. I know we've been really focused on Iraq and Baghdad and, this sort of region, but we gotta remember where it all began, right?
930, they stole the Black Stone, the Holy of Holies, from the Kaaba.
Not good.
A terrible blow to Abbasid prestige. In Central Asia, the Persian Samanids carved out their own empire and declared independence.
And once again, the Sassanid Persian Empire is long, long gone at this point. It's hundreds of years gone. But like I said, Persian identity and Persian culture in one way or another survived. And we can, I think, really see that Persian influence. Now we have two independent states in the East. How often the East will rise up, revolt, all the unrest. We can, I think, really see that identity, the fact that there is an identity that is really, separate in some ways from the identity of the Caliphate.
This was the height of the so-called Persian intermezzo, when native Persian dynasties ruled in Persia once more. Increasingly, the Abbasid Caliph was said to reign, but not rule.
Seems like it.
He'd become a symbol without power, often under the thumb of his vizier. By the 930s, the Caliph had lost control of both the civilian administration and army command.
Goddamn, so not only is he losing a bunch of his territory, but even the territory he technically does control, he is merely a figurehead over it. He's lost control of military command and lost control of civil administration, which has gone to the vizier. This is something you'll commonly see throughout the Islamic world. These viziers at times are very powerful characters. You can see at different points in different states throughout Islamic history, your figurehead caliph or emperor or whomever we're talking about at that time becoming less and less powerful as their main advisor, their vizier, becomes more and more powerful.
Which was handed over to a new official, the Amir al-Umara, commander of the commanders.
Oh, okay.
The final humiliation came in 945. The Buyids were Shiite warlords from the Dailam Mountains of northwestern Persia. But their first success was in Fars, before they went on to seize control of Persia and Iraq.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so now you're really losing territory in the absolute center, the core of your empire. This is just getting worse and worse. The Abbasid Caliphate, it's not even that it's falling apart, it's just being eaten. Chunks of it are just being taken here and there, and it's sort of slowly just being taken away.
Triumphal entry into Baghdad was a deep humiliation for the Sunni Abbasids.
I'm sure.
Yet they retained the title of Caliph, as no more than figureheads under Buyid command.
Well, and this is sort of what I was implying earlier, but at a lot of points in Islamic history, especially sort of the further we get from those initial caliphates, oftentimes the title of caliph will be more a symbolic one or a more religious one, and at times may not connote that much political authority.
And spectators to these turbulent times. 2 decades later, another Shiite dynasty, the Fatimids, swept along the North African coast, conquered Egypt, and founded Cairo as the capital of their own caliphate.
Yeah, and the Fatimids, they're pretty famous. I've certainly heard of them before. And we see them conquering a serious amount of territory, including, most importantly, Egypt, as we talked about. Rich culture, rich history, pretty prosperous. So that's it's a pretty key territory right there.
Some historians label this the Shiite century, with Shiite dynasties ruling twin caliphates and dominating much of the Muslim world.
Yeah.
But it was not to last.
Oh.
A dangerous new Sunni power was poised to burst out of Central Asia. The Seljuk Turks.
Here we go. We've talked about how the Turks had become influential in the caliphate by being brought in and sort of rising up. And I mentioned, when I think about the Turks, I often think of sort of this military migration into the region. And here we have the Seljuk Turks, who may perhaps be the most responsible for that characterization, though not solely responsible. But at this point, the Seljuk Turks, they're about to make some big changes. The Sunni revival. And the religious dynamics are fascinating too.
The Seljuk Turks were pastoralists, nomadic livestock farmers from the Central Asian steppe.
And remember, we've already talked about how a lot of these horse-arching cultures emerge from the steppe. I mean, it's just a landscape that is well-suited to a nomadic lifestyle. And of course, that means a very close relationship with cavalry, with horse riding. The peoples of these region become very talented at these types of things, and that, it may be used in a non-military way, but often is utilized in a military manner. Oftentimes you have the tribes of the steppe fighting amongst each other, or you have them being brought into warfare between sedentary civilizations, as is going to happen here. They're now playing a role throughout the sort of broader, I guess they're sort of moving into the Middle Eastern region, or like Western Asia.
Fierce warriors who became champions of Sunni Islam. At the end of the 10th century, possibly in response to climate change, they swept south into Khorasan.
Hey, there you go. There's another way that your climate, your environment can be important. I was talking about sort of the geographical qualities of the steppe and how that leads to this nomadic horse-based lifestyle, and perhaps their move was due to climate change. So there's another environmental influence. I think if you look at history, often I am surprised, maybe you would be too, at how important environment, geography, and climate can be.
The Ghaznavid Empire, successor to the Samanids, was first to fall. The Seljuk Turks were unstoppable, surging westwards across the Persian plateau taking Baghdad and toppling the Buyids, crushing a Byzantine army at Manzikert.
Yep, Manzikert. And, a lot of my knowledge of the Seljuks, well, they'll be here for a while, but I know a bit about them in the context of the Roman Empire and their conflict with the Romans, or the Byzantines, as they are labeled here. And so when you think about them coming from the steppe, and I say, well, I know a bit about their conflict with the Romans, you go, wait a minute, that's a far distance to go. Yeah, look at the map right now. Yeah, and Manzikert, that's one I know a bit about, really sort of important battle in the region. They have expanded so rapidly and become so powerful in such a short period of time. And, we see other examples of this, particularly nomadic cultures. These well-trained military cultures, they can expand quickly. The question is, can they hold on to that territory? That is the real test.
And forging the great Seljuk Empire. Their triumph was tempered by the arrival of European crusaders.
Yep, and now we're hitting this. So many things coming together, and now we're hitting the time of the First Crusade, which is really the only crusade that I know much about. It's sort of interesting to see a lot of these historical trends, a lot of these events interacting. A good reminder of how interconnected this region is, really is sort of a central point between, you're talking at this time, North Africa, Europe, especially Mediterranean Europe, and then West Asia, the steppe, the Middle East, a lot of these different regions and cultures all meeting together in this one place.
Jerusalem in 1099, and carved out a series of crusader states.
Yep.
One Shia sect, shrouded in legend, struck back at the Seljuks with deadly precision.
Whoa.
In 1092, Nizam al-Mulk, vizier of the Seljuk Empire, was killed by the Order of Assassins, its hit squad disguised as Sufi mystics. The Assassins, or Hashashin as they're known in Arabic, were a new Ismaili military order formed in the mountains of northwestern Persia.
Oh, wow.
Facing powerful enemies, but without an army of their own, they turned to subterfuge and assassination to achieve their goals. Many fanciful stories are told about the Assassins, but the order was real and feared, and responsible for scores of political murders over the next 2 centuries. Under the Seljuks, Abbasid caliphs
Goodness gracious, just look at this map. And of course, just to go back to the Crusades a little bit, we're talking about how this is a really bad time for the caliphate. Now you have Christians occupying the Holy Land. Now, most of the Crusades were big failures. The First Crusade is, if you want to talk about a crusade that went well for the Crusaders, the First Crusade would be the one that you pointed to. A lot of the other Crusades did not go very well, and the Crusaders ended up doing a lot of damage to a lot of different people, not just the people of this region. But anyway, if you want to look at this from a Muslim perspective, that is a pretty terrible loss. You have Christians occupying the Holy Land. If you look at it from the perspective of the Abbasids, they've basically lost everything. They're screwed. And you have this great Seljuk Empire. You have the Sultanate of Rome, aka, the Sultanate of Rome, out here in sort of the western section of this map. That goes very deep into Roman territory, very deep into Anatolia. I mean, as you can see, it's getting pretty close to Constantinople itself. So not only has the Abbasid Caliphate been sort of eaten alive, and a lot of these other states have been eaten alive, but the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, is now being eaten by the expansion of the Seljuks. Truly, truly remarkable. A lot of big changes in a relatively short period of time.
Continued to reign as spiritual leaders and figureheads.
Yes.
But the 12th century saw the fracturing of the great Seljuk Empire.
There you go.
A familiar story of disputed successions.
Yeah, never lasts for too long.
And local governors making their bid for power. Sensing weakness, in 1136, Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtafi raised his own army to reassert Abbasid independence.
Wow.
For the first time in nearly 2 centuries.
My
He
goodness.
took control of Baghdad, and in 1157 held it against a Seljuk siege.
Okay.
After generations of foreign subjugation, the Abbasids had re-emerged as an independent power.
Wow, we've really seen a lot of ups and downs throughout this video. We've covered a long span of time, going on centuries. You know, we've really seen sort of the height of the Abbasids, particularly at the end of the last video, the beginning of this one, then sort of the slow decline as everything falls apart with some brief upward momentum. Then they reach their rock bottom, basically no Abbasid Caliphate, or at least the Abbasids are only figureheads, with the real power brokers being others. And now we're finally seeing a bit of a resurgence.
But it would soon all come crashing down.
Oh. Okay, my goodness. They swept through the city like hungry falcons attacking a flight of doves, or like raging wolves attacking sheep, as the population died at the hands of the invaders.
In the 13th
I think I know what we're getting to.
century, a new force from the east tore through the Islamic world.
Yes, we have another nomadic people from the east who sweep through the region and many other regions, able to expand extremely rapidly. Let's see them.
Scattering armies and destroying every city that did not submit to them.
The Mongols. Here we go.
First to fall, the Khwarezmian Empire.
And you want to talk, I mean, look, the Seljuks, absolutely impressive. But you want to talk about a nomadic empire that expanded quickly and truly covered an unimaginable amount of territory. The Mongols are where it's at.
Empire, successor to the Seljuks, overrun by the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan. By 1256, his grandson, Hulagu, was poised to renew the onslaught. But first, he turned his attention to the assassins, rumored to be plotting his death.
Uh-oh.
The order was scattered and crushed.
Damn.
2 years later, Hulagu advanced against the Abbasid Caliphate.
The remaining Abbasid Caliphate.
As his armies neared Baghdad, he sent a stern warning to Caliph al-Mustasim, demanding the city's surrender.
And this is how the Mongols operated. You know, they ordered your city surrender, and if you did surrender, you would mostly be okay. If you didn't surrender, then, well, you would be in store for something truly horrible.
Despite the Mongols' terrifying record of destroying any city that opposed them, al-Mustasim decided Baghdad's walls could keep out any steppe nomads.
Okay, I guess we'll see.
He was wrong.
Oh.
After half Baghdad's garrison was massacred in a disastrous sortie, the city surrendered.
And that's exactly what you get. Now, he's betting that, well, you know, this is a steppe nomadic army. They don't have, you know, competency in siege warfare. And sure, they didn't have as much competency in siege warfare as a sedentary civilization might have had. And this is something that a lot of big empires like the Romans bet on this too. Sort of the best move when you're encountered with a group like this is to either pay them off or try and hide behind your walls. But there's a lot of ways to get into the city. Someone might let you in. You might have a situation like this where the defenders sortie out, get massacred, and then either you can make your way in or the city surrenders, and at this point, you're not getting any mercy from them.
Hulagu was in no mood for mercy. a contemporary chronicler described the horrors that followed. The people of Baghdad were put to the sword and subjected to 40 days of killing, pillaging, and enslavement. They tortured people to extort their wealth.
Yeah, and as we've talked about, Baghdad was this truly impressive city. And, you know, a lot has happened, but I think Baghdad was still a really sort of monumental city of the medieval world at this point. You know, prosperous, a lot of culture, art, education, science, all that sort of stuff. And so, you know, this is sort of especially impactful.
They killed men, women, and children. A great part of the city, including the Caliph's mosque, was burnt, and the city laid in ruins.
Wow.
The dead lay like mounds in the streets and markets. The death toll is unknown, but was in the many thousands. Allegedly, only Christians were spared, thanks to the intercession of Hulagu's Christian wife.
Okay. The Christians had an in. Jesus.
Baghdad's libraries were destroyed.
Right.
Their books
and, you know, I sort of mentioned this, but yeah, this is, along with the great human cost, you know, the sort of humanitarian disaster, comes something like this. Because Baghdad was such an important city of learning, education, art, etc., etc., you could have something like this. This was a massive sort of intellectual, ideological loss.
Manuscripts representing centuries of Muslim scholarship were thrown into the Tigris River so that it was said to run black with ink.
That's sort of the famous line.
Al-Mustasim was...
That's something I've heard before. You often hear the river ran red with blood to show the brutality of an event, and this sort of parallels that. You know, apparently they threw so much literature into the river that it ran black with ink. You know, sort of just a way to show the absolute loss of literature that occurred here.
Forced to witness this terrible destruction. Then, according to several sources, he was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death.
Oh, God.
As Mongols feared to spill royal blood.
Oh, interesting. God, what a way to go. That sounds, you know, painful, horrible, and humiliating. Rolled in a carpet and trampled. Jesus Christ, what a way to go, man.
Caliph of Baghdad was dead. Never again would the Abbasids hold meaningful political power.
Damn.
Al-Mustasim was not the last Abbasid caliph. The line would continue.
The line would continue, but, you know, as they pointed out, without any real political, practical influence.
Under the Mamluk Sultanate that now ruled Egypt.
Right, and this is when another instance, I mentioned this earlier, another instance of, you know, your caliph, your dynasty, are just figureheads. They're symbolic figures, as opposed to your real rulers. In this case, the Mamelukes. This is another example of that.
But his successors in Cairo were merely ceremonial figures.
Yeah.
Religious leaders with little power. The last caliph, Al-Mutawakkil III, surrendered to the Ottoman Empire in 1517.
How about that, though? That's pretty fascinating. We have this dynasty, this line continuing, though not as important, you know, fully symbolic, but continuing up until the Ottomans. The Ottomans seized the title of caliph. And then you have this interesting situation where you once again have a combination of real political power, right? The Ottoman Sultan absolutely has political power, and this position of caliph, this sort of religious power. Though, you know, I think it sort of loses some of its influence under these conditions.
And was taken away as a prisoner to Constantinople. It was a humiliating fate for a dynasty that had once ruled one of history's greatest empires.
Yeah.
One that had dominated the Middle East, that had taken on and defeated the Byzantines in the west, and Chinese in the east,
That's true.
that had overseen a great flourishing of scholarship, culture, technology and trade, and reigned over the era that is remembered as Islam's golden age.
Yeah, look, when your empire stretches from Spain to China, the outskirts, that's pretty impressive. That's truly remarkable. And now that's a sort of brief period. You know, we really only have one major interaction with the Chinese that we talked about last time, and then both sort of pull back a little bit. And as we saw, you know, control was quickly lost over the Iberian Peninsula and then over a good chunk of North Africa. But still, sort of the maximum extent of that territory is truly amazing.
For centuries to come, Islamic leaders would assert their legitimacy by claiming descent from this one towering dynasty,
Wow.
the Abbasids. Thanks again to...
Incredible! So I will say, once again, please check out the original video. It's linked down below. Leave them a like, subscribe to their channel, check out their sponsor. Please show them support for making these fantastic videos. You know, especially because this is a new video. I want you guys to show them support, you know, support them, check out their sponsor, like all that stuff. We want to support the original creators. Anyway, that was a fantastic video. I really enjoyed this, you know, brief two-part series. We saw the rise of the Abbasids, which was some fascinating stuff, and the fall of the Abbasids. Something that, you know, it's interesting. I don't know too much about the Abbasids in particular, but you span such a long period of time that it sort of touches on a lot of other things that I'm somewhat familiar with. We see a lot of familiar faces, familiar events, so yeah, really interesting stuff. I really enjoyed this one. If you guys did, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, and check out the Patreon that is linked down below. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.